Hey everybody, this is Brent Ingersoll and you are listening to the Speaking of podcast. Today, my guest is a guy named Rich Birch. He runs the Unseminary podcast and the Unseminary website where he helps church leaders navigate all the questions of leading and growing the church in today's culture and society. He's becoming a friend of mine. He has so much insight on the church and on how to navigate the times. And we talk specifically about how do we deal with the church in these times of crisis, specifically with the COVID crisis. We have an interesting discussion. I hope you enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Rich Birch. Rich, man, thank you. Thanks. So I really appreciate you, Rich, being on my my little startup podcast here.
Oh, no, it's great, man. It's so good.
I appreciate it, though. I'm glad. And I want to talk to you. It's interesting. I think back to when you were with us here at King's Church, came up, did some consulting and helped us just think through some things. Was that this year?
Yeah, it was like 5 months ago, which feels like 10 years. It's crazy.
It's wild. It feels like a lifetime ago. And it was just
so
winter.
true. So true.
We were here. In fact, like we were already hoping for spring at that point. I think you're like late February maybe or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It was right before all this started, or the coronavirus stuff started. And so, yeah, it's been, what a crazy year. It's been unbelievable, but it was fun being there. I loved getting to meet your team and seeing the good things that God's doing at King's. That, obviously I've heard about the church, but it was fun getting a chance to kind of see it up close. So, I was excited to be there.
Man, you were a huge blessing, and the team still talks about you. So you left,
that's good.
Positive mark. No, it was nice. Maybe it's the Canadian in you, but like you came as a wellspring of knowledge, but you didn't act like a know-it-all. Like you had this phrase, so like everyone would listen to you. So
yeah, that's fun. That's fun.
It was good, but I wanted to talk to you. I want to talk to you about. Okay, you just said it in the. It feels like 10 years ago, and I don't know if you saw that. I don't know if you saw that New York Times article. I don't know. It came out maybe a week or two ago, maybe longer now. But again, time is just weird. But even in the journalist, he says, it feels like this year is taking forever on the one hand, but in actuality, it's speeding everything up.
Absolutely,
everything is just like, and basically, I think the title of the article was like "Waking Up in 2030." That like we're watching a decade of transformation happen basically in months.
Very quickly. Yeah, absolutely.
His whole point, he doesn't really reference the church per se or Christianity in any way, but the fact that we're all dealing with the reality of the landscape is changing. And man, I thought it'd be awesome just to be able to talk to you, not just as a Christian, but as a church leader.
Sure.
And get your gut and your 2 cents on, where you're seeing this thing track for better and worse. And, and if you were even able to kind of take your, unseminary, believing the best for the church hat off and just give the raw and the real. Like I want the real, like I know you've probably consulted with some churches that they wanted you to tell them what they wanted to hear.
Well, I am definitely I'm a 3/4 cup full leader. Like I'm definitely an optimist. And so, I think the same thing about the church. Like I do actually think that in times of great adversity, the church shines. And so we are in a time of great adversity, and I've seen all kinds of really good signs of, kind of happening around us, signs of real positive things happening around us. And I do think that framework, and people keep saying that framework of what we're seeing is accelerated change, is really helpful for us actually as we look to the future. Because I think there are changes that we were all experiencing that were kind of part of all of our churches, that what's happened and what is happening is, just we're continuing to see that. And so, there's a couple that jump to mind. The one that, but I'm going to start with one that you maybe not, that I don't hear anybody talking about. And so, and this one, you're going to be like, why did I bring this guy on? You're going to cut all of this. He's like, this is super strange. So
I have no agenda. Just, I want to talk.
So one of the things so I am the son of a automotive parts manufacturer. So my dad's an engineer. I grew up in one of those homes that, even though I'm Canadian, we grew up in one of those homes like you got to buy an American car. You remember those homes? Remember people used to say that? It was like, you got to buy one of the big three.
Yeah.
And so we grew up and down the 401. That's a highway here in Ontario. That basically, there's a series of kind of car plants that make parts and stuff that all filter down into Detroit. And so the car, I found, has always been an interesting cultural kind of icon. So anyways, in our little world, in our church world, the car is it's a huge part of what we do. Like, people get in vehicles and come to our ministries. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, if you and I were pastoring, we would have been, we would have, or even probably more than that, 70 years ago, we would have had to pastor a church that people could walk to, right? It was this idea of the parish, the round the corner, people came to those. But then what the car did, the car created the mega church. If it wasn't for the car, there wouldn't be mega churches. People didn't drive past lots of other churches. Right. The car created the non-denominational church because you could kind of create your own deal. So the interesting thing is, if you there's this driving study that they've been doing for almost 100 years, where they look at the total number of hours that people drive in a car, and that has been consistently going up until 2008. And
what's it called? The study? I've heard it. It's not Occam's razor. That's
no. So this study is. Let me pull it up here. 1 second. I will get you the actual name. It's there's this study is actually it's what do you call it, like a US government study that looks at the amount of time that people spend in the car, and it is from I'm just pulling up the actual most recent one.
There was like a term though, that it's about like the
Marchetti's constant. That's what you're talking about.
That's
Marchetti's constant. That's related actually. So the study that I'm talking about it's just the 12-month rolling average. It's from the U.S. Federal Highway Administration. Like, I talk about how boring this is, but what it does is it shows that people kept driving in their cars, and that kept going up and up and up until the last recession, 2008, and then we saw it go down. But it didn't go back up to where it was before. It didn't re-engage. It didn't get as high as it was before, which is what had happened with every other recession before. It continued to go up. Now, I think what we're in the middle of with all of this stuff, with people living at home, we're going to see that trend continue. The problem with that for you and I is most of our churches are based on the premise of people getting in their cars and driving over to them. And so this is I know we've been like excited about the digital thing. It's really it's a trend that's underneath of that, which is what's happening with people's transportation, their preferences for transportation. And so the difficulty, I think, before all this, I used to say when it's like when you have one of those weird conversations where you start talking about strange stuff with church leaders, I would always say, hey, what are we doing in a world where people are driving their cars less? What are we doing that's encouraging them to get in their cars to actually come and see us, to actually come and be a part of our ministries? And that trend is going to continue. And the difficulty for you and for me is, we have to, I think very carefully about the kinds of in-person experiences we do going forward. I think we are going to be doing digital, that's an assumed piece of the equation, right? We're going to do both digital and in person, but in person, I think we have to think very carefully about, because if we just go back to what we've always done, in the same way that companies are not saying, hey, why don't you keep driving into our office anymore? What they're saying is, you stay home. That's fine. The same thing, we need to be wrestling through on the because I do think there is value in person, but I think we're going to see increased pressure on that, and it's going to feel strange for people. I think on the multi-site front, one of the things that this is going to push us towards is actually more campuses rather than less. People are going to look for where, and Marchetti's constant is that other thing you had talked about, which that's this even longer term study that says that people historically have only traveled 30 minutes to go to work every day. And so as technology has changed, they've moved farther and farther away from work. So when they could walk, they lived closer. Then they got on a horse, they could go a little bit farther away. Then they had a buggy, they could go even farther away. And then the car is kind of the biggest jump in Marchetti's that created the suburbs. Ultimately, all of us would be living in city centers if it wasn't for for the vehicle ultimately, which is what Marchetti's constant drives towards. So I personally I think if we see a continued rapid decline of the use of the car as a mode of transportation, which we were seeing before this, that's going to put pressure on the footprint of our campuses. The idea of like we have 1,000 people in a room somewhere with an ocean of parking. I mean, executive pastor type. I spent a lot of time thinking about parking. That stuff is, I think, 10 years from now, I think we're going to look back and say, wow, like I can't believe we ever used to get 1,000 people to come into a room. And it's not just going to be the digital thing. It's going to be a shift in the pattern of how they spend their lives. They don't want to drive as much as they used to. Yeah, like they're more cocooned than they used to.
So what you're saying, both those studies really are saying, so the Marchetti's constant thing that people are only willing to drive up to 30 minutes, that's really measuring how fast one can travel. And now we literally are living through the time where, well, you can work anywhere now because I can be on a Zoom call in Beijing if I want. And we just, these last several months, I mean, I've been thinking, what are the companies that are renting a floor in the New World Trade Center?
Oh yeah.
That we just spent the last 3 months, paying for space that they don't need. And they're like, I'm paying millions of dollars probably a month to occupy this space. And so I think that was like a death blow on how travel and commerce used to function. And now there's not even necessity for, I mean, we're starting to get groceries different. We're starting to we're Uber eating and all that stuff. So it's like,
but in your own life, I'd love to know for you, Brent, like, so what I've noticed in this kind of more digital age that we've lived over these last few months is I have become way more tightly bound to my house. So like, even though we're more digital, ironically, there's a Shoppers Drug Mart for our Canadian listeners. They'll know Shoppers. That is walkable distance to me. I don't know. I've gone to that Shoppers way more in the last 3 months than I have in the 4 years that we've lived here because it was just right there. And so I would because I was on calls all day, I'm like, I'm just going to walk over to Shoppers and buy whatever, rather than getting in my car and on the way home from work, stopping at the big Loblaws or the big Metro or something like that. I'm tighter to my house. Have you found that too? That this kind of increased digital, that it's this weird, like I'm more globally connected, but I'm actually my own physical body. I am a lot closer, I don't drive my car as much. I'm much tighter to my house.
I think those things are happening simultaneously. Like there is that, like, okay, now that I live in this nebulous world of internet connection, I think there's maybe a correlating kickback. And that is, I think, making people take maybe more value into that plot of land that they own, their own home, and create this space that, okay, this is where I'm going to really live and I'm hunkering down. So it's an interesting thought to take over to the church and how that's going to trade. Like, I don't think people are going to be as frequently traveling as frequently in the future as we used to. I think we'll drive less. I think we'll fly less. I mean, that's I mean, we see Air Canada just this week they're dumping flights left and right and cutting, it's crazy. So this is happening, and that's the stuff that I'm just trying to think through as a church leader. We've got one facility that, and we're still trying to process through right now as of the time of this recording. Like we can have some people in the facility, but it's that clunky. You can't do kids ministry. You can only get X amount of people in. It's not even a critical mass. Is this even worth it? We're still really wrestling through all those dynamics. But man, as I look forward, well, one of the things we're going to be doing is rolling out home churches, which I think a lot of churches even large churches like us are thinking through as a better long-term strategy to kind of run sidecar with online. And then whatever it is that we figure out for the other sort of mid-size or even large venue, that stuff to me is right now in flux, and I don't totally know where it's going to land. I think cellular community is going to be a heightened value, and I think the online kind of being the thread that basically is the central component of a church. Like I just said to our lead team this past week, just so it's official. It used to be that Central King's Church was out of the Quispamsis, Kennebecasis Valley location. You visited.
Yes.
It's
Yep.
not. It's now on the internet. Like King's
Right.
Church Central is digital now.
Yep.
And
Right.
like, so everything's just sort of shifting. So
Well,
if,
on that, I'd love to ask you a question on that. As you're thinking about
how did I get interviewed here? You know, that's when you know. That's when you know.
the thing that I find interesting about church, maybe I'll phrase it as a statement. The thing that's interesting about church online is, and I don't know how to say this delicately. So there's going to be some listeners that are listening in that are like, "Oh gosh, I can't believe you just said that." But you know, there's an interesting. Well, I'll use the retail example, and then I'll talk about church. So I've traveled a lot across North America, and I'll go into a community, and like everywhere I go, people think that where they live is super unique. It's super them. It's like we're like snowflakes. We're so different. But then when I look at the corner, I'm like, oh, that's a McDonald's with a Home Depot and a whatever, and it's like the same development that just has been banged out all across North America. And the same is true in the church world. Like I can go into churches that are like, oh, we're very different, but then actually when I attend, I'm like, oh, we're singing the same 3 songs at the beginning of the service, and we have the same countdown clock as 12 other churches, and then there's a great communicator gets up, and they're not maybe preaching the same message, but it's pretty similar. And for years I've been saying to communicators, particularly, one of the things that's kind of one of the dangers, I think, or the risks of the multi-site church movement is it can give people this sense of like, oh, we're going to reach everybody. We're going to reach like across North America. And I still think that that's a bad idea. I think a church should be thinking of itself as a regional entity. Mm-hmm. It should be, and the communication should be very regional. Like I think for the most part, most churches, your church would be a great example of that. Kings should be of the Maritimes, right? It should feel like now I think what's different than a generation before is you've got a real shot at being like the church of the Maritimes. Like this is, anywhere in that kind of cultural milieu, you can reach now. Now, I think where it becomes difficult is when you would think like, okay, I'm also want to reach people in El Paso, Texas, where although that could be true, you might reach some people. I think if we tilt our services so culturally that they can reach everybody, we won't reach people then in the Maritimes. And so the thing that's difficult I find on them, or the thing that I find interesting about the kind of shift to digital, I think for individual people, the question becomes, well, if I don't have to attend a church digitally that's in my local town, why don't I just attend Elevation? Or why don't I, instead of attending the Elevation knockoff that's around the corner from us, or instead of attending the Willow Creek knockoff that's 30 minutes from me, I'm just going to listen to Willow. Like, why not do that? Have you found that kind of pressure as a communicator? How do you work that out? And how's that working in your brain?
Yeah, I think you're asking the exact right question. And I think there's probably 2 things going on. It's probably it's a mistake for any church or church communicator to say my job is to compete to get in that global sphere platform, and we're gonna minister to everyone. I do think God graces certain voices,
absolutely, absolutely,
like the TD Jakes that just the Hillsongs that just they seem to have a global print, but none of those began that way. They all I think started with a local vision. And I think the only way a church is going to be effective is if it's called to a mission field that's specific. And I think you have to speak specifically to that mission field. And I don't know. I think the speaking to the whole earth at one point, at one time is probably too broad of a starting point. So, for us at Kings, like you said, we have a maritime Canadian vision, and God's called us to these people. It's one kind of cultural context over a geographical, a fairly large geographical space, but not that much in population. So, I think for me as a communicator, great question. The way I'm thinking about it is more now than ever, I need to speak specifically to what are we in Atlantic Canada feeling with and dealing with. And, that's the voice God has given me. If God expands it across the country, which again, this is a unique thing. I mean, I've every week I'll sign if we have a new giver or someone who connects to our church, I'll sign a letter and just say thanks, and here's how you can get connected and that kind of stuff. And I've signed them from all over the States and all over Canada over this last handful of months. And so, which this brings up a question I kind of have for you is like, if we could get in the, not the Wayback Machine, but if we get like a flux capacitor and hop in the
Nice.
and I even got some sound effects. Hold on. Let me just, oh, that's a type.
That's different. Let's hope we don't end up there.
No, that's a long time ago. Don't.
Yes.
Who knows what they're flying now?
Yeah, exactly.
But if we could go to 2030, what, I guess, like who in the church, like what if churches are thinking, okay, somebody in 2030 is going to look like Netflix and someone's going to look like Blockbuster, and someone is going to be Uber and someone's going to be the taxi company, and it's going to come down to who's like guessing as to. Hopefully it's not guessing. Hopefully, Lord knows we're following the cloud and the fire and he's leading us. But I think God actually lets us think about stuff and make decisions a lot more than we're comfortable with sometimes. And, what are you thinking? Like, so that trend, like I said, of there's obviously a migration happening in the church. It is regional, but then again, there's like, you've got people who are just kind of connecting because I identify with that voice or identify with your culture and I don't necessarily live in that town. That's just one of the many things I feel like is starting to shift. And so like, what are you, if you're pointing this thing at 2030 and you're like, okay, here's the stuff that's going to be left standing. And here's the stuff that I wouldn't want to be, chained to at this point. What are those things?
Yeah, so I think one of the clear and it's interesting that we have seen this trend come up at the same time as this coronavirus thing. I think it's we're going to look back at this year and the whole area of ethnic diversity is a long-term sociological trend that for years, the world is, the country that you and I serve in, our American brothers and sisters, those communities are becoming more ethnically diverse. The way I say it to American friends is, every zip code in America is more ethnically diverse today than it was 10 years ago. And it will be more diverse 10 years from now than it is today. And I think the church, we have to deal with that. And I say that as a honky white guy. Like I am slowly sliding into that like old white guy phase of my life. When I was in college, I took one of the ironies of my life is that I end up talking a lot about church growth and think of a lot about church growth. And I only remember one lecture from Bible college times that were on church growth, and they taught this thing called the homogeneous unit principle, which I think if you were to get up and teach today, I think people would call it racist. But the idea was you want to build your church on the same type of people. Go and find a bunch of so in my case, it would be like remotely technically interested people that like Disney stuff, white people with kids, and build a church for those people. And I think that model is like outdated and old now, and that will only be the case 10 years from now. When people will look at the churches that will be left behind, will be those churches that just reflect that are mono-ethnic, that have kind of one that could be I think speaking as a white guy, I think the all white guy church thing, we need to walk away from that actively. And that's something I would say I've had that conviction and I've tried to work towards what are we doing to make our church more diverse. But I would say my conviction on that is higher now than it has ever been. What do we need to do to, help really push that and change that for the future? I don't know that just as a leader, I think I led for the first half of my ministry career, not realizing some of the privileges that I had as a guy and as a white guy that that I think I need to, as one of those people, go out of my way now to figure out what can I do, to help others. I'll give you an example. Early on in my ministry career, this was 20 years ago. I was at the Meeting House, a great church in the Toronto area, and we were just getting into multisite, and I knew that Willow Creek was doing something around this.
Yep.
But I didn't know what they were doing, but I had heard this was like the internet was out there, but it was like proto internet. There wasn't like blogs and all that stuff. And I had heard that they did something. So I literally picked up the phone and like dialed information in Chicago and said like, hey, can I get the Willow Creek Church phone number? I called up, and the person who answered the phone, I said, I know you're doing something around like multiple locations. Can I talk to that person? And ended up getting connected with a guy with the name of Jim Tomberlin, who to this day is one of my best friends. Jim's a great guy. And I asked this crazy question at the time. I said, Jim, I would love to come and spend a week with you. I just want to follow you around for a week. You don't need to even meet with me. I'll just like go to your meetings. I'll sit in the back. I want to like write notes and just kind of see your operation. And he was like, yeah, that's fine. You can come and do that. That's fine. That's a little crazy. If you want to come here and do that, that's fine. He spent the week. When I look back over my ministry career, that week was a pivotal week in my ministry.
Wow.
Because the relationships I developed that week and my confidence around what I think God was leading our church to, and even just my whole, like, ironically, the podcast and all that stuff came out of if you ask church leaders what's happening, they will tell you, and you can learn from that. Right. For years, it never dawned on me. It was like a whole category of questions that I never understood, that as a guy, I had a privilege there that female leaders didn't have.
Right.
Because I think if I was a female leader and I would have called Jim up, and I don't know, I've never actually asked Jim this question point blank, but my assumption is if I would have called up and as a female leader and said, hey, can I come spend a week with you? That would have been received a little bit stranger. Yeah. Jim and I at that week ended up at his house. We were hanging out. We spent all kinds of time together. And leadership, my experience with leadership, that my greatest leadership growth has always happened in those relational edges. They've always happened when it's not in like some seminar. It's not in even listening to something like this. It's in the like, hey, we're going out for dinner somewhere. So my increasing question is, how do I bring a more diverse group of young leaders around me? How do I invest in them? How do I find ways that's appropriate and all that to bring, more women in from a leadership point of view? So to me, I think when I look back, when you think about the Blockbuster Netflix issue, I think the diversity thing's a huge issue. I think for all of us, we all have to wrestle with that. And it's complex because a lot of what we've done, if we're truthful, a lot of what we've done is create cultural generation machines, not necessarily gospel driving, institutions or gospel kind of communities. It's been more about like, and I've been guilty of that. Like, I've often joked, I'm like, when I die, I hope Bono's leading worship like that. I am that generation, right? I went to 2 years ago. I went to that concert where they redid the Joshua Tree album for the whole thing, and I was like, "Oh, I am a statistic." I literally, it was me and everyone else like me. It was literally, it was at the Sky Dome, 75,000 white middle-aged white guys, all loving it, right? And I was like, this, but for years, that was my perception of like, oh, that is the highest cultural expression, you could have. Yes. That's just not true, right? That's just, that's nowhere true. So
it's interesting. This is in front of us right now. Like it's obvious that this is happening. And I think the church is being forced to deal with it. And step one is exactly what you're saying. It's old white guys like us who have in a certain, this certain level of ignorance even about our own biases or just like presumptions and like privilege, I guess, yes, is the word. And we just operate within that framework and haven't had to actually think outside of that really objectively until now. I literally just finished preaching this weekend sermon before we jumped on this conversation. And like I usually steer clear of this, but I did a whole, like I talked about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And my one of our pastors here, Bradford, he doesn't have the same skin color as me, and he's just looking at me like, bro, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Right. No, absolutely. Well, and I think those are all good examples. I think, and you're, one of the things I appreciate about you is you're an open communicator, and you'd be open to that kind of feedback and take that. But we need those kind of filters in our communication. We had a similar thing with Tim Lucas at Liquid Church. He's really good at getting feedback. And this is an example I've used with other people. We were working, this is before he went out and preached, like on a Thursday night, they do this thing called the Thursday night gospel hour. And he was telling this story where he said, he was talking about taking his kids to Pottery Barn. And like, hey, it was so great going to Pottery Barn, and like, and we, we had to like time out and say, Tim, that is such a, like, that is not even within kind of honky culture, is that a subculture, but it's like a niche kind of thing. And I know that we will have, a whole bunch of people that will just disconnect, and they will miss the point of the story because they're thinking, my pastor takes his kids to Pottery Barn to buy toys. Like what? Like that is like, I could never afford that. And so, I think we have to work. It's at that kind of granular level. We've got to work to ensure that we're doing everything we can, and to listen. And there's so much there. And I feel like I love the Andy Stanley question. What do you do when you realize you're the most powerful person in the room? And I have had actually this year, I've had more of those kind of experiences where I literally was like, oh, like I'm the one that actually gets to choose right now. Like I'm the one that has that opportunity. And with great kind of care, go to the Lord and say, hey, Lord, hey, what is it you want to do in this moment? So yeah, to me, that's a huge issue.
I think you're hitting on a big theme though, in this whole, like, what's happening right now, the 2020 to 2030 continuum.
Yep.
Is that the same way that time feels like it's slowing down, it's actually speeding up. And in the same way that it feels like we've never been growing further apart as far as isolation and, physical distancing and all that, it's actually causing humanity to have to come together in certain ways. I mean, you think through like some of the older models, and I'm not going to be one who get up to get on a soapbox and say, how stupid was that? Things are effective in their time, and it is what it is. But you think of some of the old models of even, on one mega church campus having, in one auditorium we have contemporary, and then another auditorium you have blended, and then you have in the chapel you have where the seniors can go and they can enjoy it their way. You wonder if the church isn't in 10 years going to just be beyond that.
Sure.
That whole that it goes further than just like hopefully it'll go further than just the obvious divisions between socioeconomic and racial divides, but that generational, like that, the God is building a church that is unified, and that means we have to come further than I need Bono leading worship, or I need whoever, Christopher Cross or some other person that's
right,
the old white guy.
Yeah, so I agree. I think there is that. How do we inculcate in the next generation this idea that it's not about them, and that how do we I'm a Gen Xer. I'm solidly Gen X, born in 1974. I'm the bottom of the they talk about boom bust echo. Yeah. I'm literally 1974 is the lowest birth rate of the 20th century. It was, so I'm like, I am classic Gen X. And so no one, so what that means is there is nothing targeted at me. Like through my whole life, there has never been I'm like the I don't know what it feels like to be the desired economic engine. But what I do know is I was taught, I think consumer culture taught us to, we want to have what we want, and it needs to be for us, and it needs to make me feel great. And so, and that is like the opposite of what Jesus calls us to, right? Jesus calls us to live other-centered lives. Like he calls us to reorient our lives around other people and their needs, and put their needs ahead of ours. And so even in this whole area of worship, I've been joking about this for 10 years. I keep saying to the worship guys, if I like it, that's a problem. Like it needs to grate on me. There needs to be some part of this that's like, I don't know, like this just doesn't sound great to me.
Yeah.
And I think we all need to be in that spot. You know, there's another cultural thing that I've wondered about and it's like a little bit on that acceleration thing that I've like seen this accelerating, and I wonder if it's going to speed up.
Yeah.
Like when I started in ministry, which it sounds like, it's like such an old guy thing to say, but it's true. When I started in ministry, the first church I served in, we are what I would say our commitment model, what we were saying to people that they had to do. We would say, come to Sunday morning service.
Yep.
And then go home. We'll go to Swiss Chalet and go for that, and then get changed, and then come back Sunday night. So that's two things. We'd say come back for a different Sunday night service, and then we would say, well, you've got to do some sort of small group. You were in some sort of small group.
Yep.
But then you'd come back for Wednesday night prayer meeting.
Yep.
And then you would also be volunteering on some team. So you had maybe 5 or maybe as many as 6 kind of things that you were committed to.
Right.
Where that really has collapsed considerably, right? Like the Sunday evening service, the Wednesday night prayer service, for the most part, those kinds of things have gone out of our models. And like even Willow, we've talked about them earlier, right? Like they had the idea of the midweek service. That was like such an innovation, right? Like we're going to have these 2 different styles of service. Mm-hmm. All of that's gone. Yeah. I think there is I don't think there definitely is a shift between people wanting access and not ownership. So people want, and you mentioned it, Netflix. People used to like have DVD collections, right? They used to like, you would like prove your nerddom by the piles of DVDs you had in your house. Well, that's all gone, right? Now you just pay Netflix, whatever it is, $13.99 a month, and you get access to them. Music is a strange thing, right? Like you used to collect music, and now, I've got an Amazon Alexa. She's going to talk to me in a second here. And, I just call out to her, and somehow music comes into my house. It has not felt like to me that I have bought that music either. It hasn't felt like it's just somehow I have access to it. I think that is going to, or is shaping, even the idea of membership, like there's a whole, like, how, like, do people really want to be members anymore? Like, is that a thing? And how does that, there's a little bit of, I think there's questions in this area. I've definitely have more questions than I've got answers. I think that is changing the way people think about church, because we're not. Yeah, absolutely.
So my question for you would be, because I think that's happening, and you fight it or fund it, right? Like with we can either view it as a strength or a weakness, but it's both. And so how do we, if access instead of ownership, and like the idea of membership is going to be a little more foreign in the future, then how do we call people to selflessness and care? What opportunities are in here when it comes to following Jesus? Because I refuse to believe that there's not some kind of cruciform vision, even within the age of subscription based association, and
yep.
I'm not saying that I think we're going to need to subscribe to church, but what does subscription, what does that tell us about people, and what's the call I think need to be to the Christ follower, and what does the church need to do in light of that?
Yeah. So I do think that there's something around, we for sure have seen a shift in the last 10 years towards much stronger discipleship models that put service, getting involved, actually doing something in the church earlier in the kind of process of people getting connected to the church. So the idea of you can belong before you necessarily believe, where again, it was not strange when I started in ministry that it was like, you had to have been in the church for a year before you could even take the membership class. And that process was X number of months long. Right. Where now I do think the opportunity is to say to people, like, you arrived this weekend, great. Why don't you join us in the mission next weekend? And here is your piece of the puzzle that you can do as a brand new person. And it's like, you're fully engaged. Like, because I think a part of what the access, not ownership, kind of shift in culture, what that has meant is I get everything right from the beginning. And so I think what we've got to do is accelerate the way we help people get connected. We don't hold back with connection. We actually say, hey, we'd love for you to get plugged in. Now, that I think that's going to mean, that does, I don't think that means more messy models, right? You get to like, okay, so what do you do with insert X, Y, whatever the sin is that freaks you out? What do you do when that person wants to start serving next weekend?
Yep.
I think it actually ironically goes back to more of what the the New Testament church was like. Paul was consistently like, we see all that stuff that Paul was preaching against because there was bad things happening in the church. Like, he was having to say, oh, no, just guys. Okay. Let me explain to you again. Okay. The gospel does give you total freedom, but if you could please not sleep with your mom, that would be great.
Now put with the communion elements,
Yes. Right. And exactly. Absolutely. And so I think there is, like, I've often thought that when I read all of that stuff by Paul, I'm like, I don't think I preach or teach or proclaim a gospel that is big enough to create all the mess that it creates in the New Testament, right? Like the gospel fully understood, I do think, leaves someone with saying, oh, so that means I can do anything? And you're like, well, you're totally free in Christ. Yes, that is true. He wants to change everything about that. He wants to radically change everything about who you are. And so I do think there's an opportunity in there where we used to, we got talking about this. My wife and we're reading through the New Testament right now. We got talking about the Pharisees and like, I feel like it's like the Pharisees, every time Jesus takes on the Pharisees, I feel like, oh, he's taking on a bit of me. Like, totally. It's like, oh, that's me, because we look at them now as they were like, and this, we look at them now as like, oh, they're like these bad guys, but that wasn't the case. They were the back to the Bible movement. They had really big hearts, and they were like, I just want to make it more accessible. So what we're going to do is we're going to make up these other rules. We're going to give you these other hoops to jump through. And when you jump through those hoops, that'll guarantee you that you're not, you're not going to break the law. And I'm like, that sounds a lot like our churches, right? We can do that with people where we're like, well, why don't you just sit for a while and then just sit in our teaching, and then eventually you'll get a chance to serve. Where I think we've got to turn that upside down, and we're seeing that. There's lots of examples of churches that are saying, hey, you're here. Why don't you jump in and serve right away? We want to find a spot for you to plug into the mission.
Yeah, and we got to trust. I mean, that is the word access is the gospel. I mean, that's Jesus came to give us access to his glory, eternal life, all of it, and he paid the subscription. And I think the thing, it's such a good point, Rich, and just this idea though of like, I think as church, we have to be willing to trust the power of grace and risk the mess. Like, it's too hard to control because, is so-and-so going to be allowed to do this and this, and all the criteria that we place, it just that blows it up the moment you just say, no, you can come and be part of this community no matter who you are and what you've done and what you're into, and I think we need to figure out a way to let grace be as wild and scandalous and difficult to control as it actually is, and realize that doesn't negate the truth, like that the scripture says. And yet I think the mistake the church has probably made in the past, and maybe this is a season where God's bringing us a step further out of that, where we lead with, here's what you need to do to be part of this community, and you need to figure this out until you can get in X amount deep. So and
there was a bunch of that, and I'm sure you've traveled. We haven't talked about this, but I'm sure you've traveled internationally. And one of the things that's weird I have found about, and man, I might get you some hate email for this. When you travel to, like, I'll call it like a heavily missionized, like a place where there's been like a real missions movement.
Yep.
It's weird to go into. I had this experience in a couple places in Africa where it was like a real honor to go to this service. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But I would go to the service and I was unsettled and sad because I'm like, oh, this looks like Wheaton, Illinois. Like this, someone showed up and told these people 50 years ago that this is what church is, and what it was a particular cultural expression, and so it was like, wear this kind of suit and like look like this, and that was, and I'm afraid that I've been a part of that, right? It's like, oh gosh, hope I'm not doing that. Like, hope I don't want to get people, it's that friend, our mutual friend, Carrie Newhoff says, like, the saddest thing that can happen to someone is when they come to our church and all they find is us, there's all they found is like, oh, these are a bunch of human ideas or a bunch of human cultural kind of trends. And so, it's
I saw that in Haiti, and we have a partner church there that we're involved with. And like, when I was there, there was a lot of it mirrored a lot of my grandparents' church, to be quite frank, and like the legalism, and I felt honestly like this untethered liberal that doesn't care about anything,
right,
which isn't the truth. But
yes,
so that, I mean, we'll bring it in for a landing here in a minute, Rich. But I think we're getting onto, again, just like where some of this is going. And the biggest thing, I think we just struck the nerve that's probably closest to God's heart, and that is, if the church can't let go of some of the old forms, to carry the heart of the law instead of the form of it moving forward, and we don't get ourselves in this posture where we're able to reshape and take a new shape for a new time. I think we're going to sink, and we're going to go down with these times. We're not going to, those churches aren't going to make it till 2030. The church will, the Church of Jesus Christ will. He's everlasting and ultimately adapting. But, you did a post on seminary, or it was on your podcast. I thought it was awesome, where you talked about like sort of 5 opportunities for multi-site churches moving forward. Not to rehash that, if you haven't checked it out, if you're a church leader watching, like, go check it out on seminary.com. But what are some of the things that you're saying, like, hey, let's not be all doom and gloom here. The reality is the writing's on the wall. I think there are organizations, churches, businesses, like, COVID seems to really target bodies and businesses and churches and denominations that have pre-existing underlying conditions. And that's how it's rolling. What are the opportunities? What are the opportunities kind of coming into these next years?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of opportunities, and I think that's true. One of the things that has struck me, I was, I would say I was fairly scared in March, April. I was like, oh my goodness, like, and I was scared for friends like you who work in lead local churches. I was like, man, what's going to happen here? And then as I, was just engaging with people, I kept thinking that this was the exception, that I would talk to someone like you, and I would be like, oh, well, actually, they're doing quite well. Like, and then I would talk to, and I was like, well, they must be the exception. And then I would talk to another. And what I found was, exactly to your point, churches that went into this period were quite strong. Yes, it's been a tough season, but it's not like it's been like obliterating. It's like, oh, actually, this has helped them accelerate. Yeah. I think the 2 things that I think are huge opportunities for us in the season coming out of this. One is, I think if you're a church leader listening in, or a business leader listening in, you've been given a window to try some crazy things. You have been given a window that literally, and you can blame it on COVID, like, and you're seeing this in businesses across the, across the globe, where, you can say like, oh, we're going to do this thing now, and it's in response to COVID, and everyone will be like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And actually try a few things. And so, like, one of the things I was saying for years, lots of multi-site churches have tried, and I didn't actually write about this in that blog post, have tried to do kind of video-driven worship experiences, have tried to do like, well, what if we had, and like, lots of churches have done it. Willow's done it. Granger did it. North Point tried it. And it was like, was not working. It was hard to try. Now I've heard of a few churches in this season that as they launch new campuses, they're basically broadcasting in their video of their worship experience within a few singers locally. And it seems to be sticking, like, oh, that seems to have a new resonance to it. Wow. Now, there was a leader this was probably in April, a church that I've done some work with. We were texting back and forth. He's like, I think we're going to try this thing. What do you think? And I'm like, try it. Like, you've got a window. So the big idea for you as a leader is, you might have had that idea floating in the back of your head, right, that you were like, I wonder if we should try this thing. I would say, go ahead and try it. Now's a great season to give it a whirl. And I think the other side of it, to be honest, is the other opportunity that we all need to look really carefully at is, I was listening recently to an interview with the Delta Airlines CEO. Fascinating interview around kind of all the things that they're dealing with. And he said something that I was like, oh, I need to listen to that carefully. He said, one of the things that their conviction on is they look at the travel that was happening pre-March 2020, and they think there might have been as much as 20% of business travel was extraneous and unneeded, that it was like businesses should not have been doing that travel. And he's like, our business was based on our margins were based on our customers traveling when they really didn't need to. Now we can bemoan that and be like, oh, I can't believe that they're not unnecessarily traveling anymore. Or we can just adjust our business and say, you know what, if we really are customer centric, we should be saying to our customers, don't travel unless you have to. And when you have to, we're here for you. We're going to do the best thing possible. And I think on the church example of that is, I think we probably have some programs that are frankly costing us mission energy. They're costing us money that we should just shut down in this season, that we should use this as an opportunity to get rid of. They're extraneous. They're not pushing us forward. If we're honest as leaders, we like to think that everything we do pushes the mission forward, but that's just not the case. That isn't the case at all. And so I think we've got to get, we could use this season particularly, and it's going to go away. That window will close, and you'll no longer be able to kind of either innovate or cut stuff with the kind of ease that you can now. And so I wouldn't lose that opportunity. I would say an area that I'm concerned about that I haven't seen any of us nail, and it's I've blogged about it and taken some heat for it, but the church online has never been a family experience. Church online is primarily individuals sitting on a computer watching the screen, and I don't know if you've seen this in your own house, but like in our house, that is what ends up happening on a Sunday morning. Is like, I'm in one room, my wife's in another room, my kids will be somewhere else, and like we try to pull everybody together, but it doesn't actually lend itself to that. It's actually a better experience if we're all by ourselves. And my kids are older, and and that's all fine, but like the church, we have to be, as senior leaders, have to be super concerned about passing the message on to the next generation. And there are lots of people innovating on the kids side in this era, but I haven't seen anybody nail it. There's not a like, okay, this is a reliable way for us to actually minister to kids. And I think before all this, I would have said one of my convictions is, when you read the statistics in our communities around what does it mean to be a family, that oftentimes what we project as family is different than what is actually family in our community. So in lots of places so using American statistics, there are more kids born to unwed moms now than to wed moms in America. That's been the case since 2015. That has been a long-term trend that has continued. When I stand at our kids' check-in, I see a ton of two-parent families show up and drop their kids off. We don't reflect our community, right? We don't reflect the communities that we serve. I'm concerned that if we don't nail that one going forward, this would be, I think, one of the biggest reasons why we've got to all figure out how to do in-person again, because of the kids ministry side of it. In fact, I think it's more important than the public teaching piece, the worship piece. Getting kids back together to be able to communicate with them is an important long-term issue. And although there's been some good stuff in the season because it's kind of shifted to parents, which I think is a positive thing. We just have to continue to be concerned about it.
Those kids need that. They need because we've done that. We've provided the materials, like even that we have drop spots that you can pick them up as a parent and walk your kid through the resources. And that's a good thing. I mean, we've got parents who are discipling their kids now that weren't before, but we were, right? So that's a win. But on the other hand, as a parent of 3 kids that, we've been fumbling along with that. And it's been great to be able to have those conversations with my kids, but that's different than my sons or my daughter, being in a worship context with other children, experiencing God together at their pace without mom and dad watching even, right? They need that freedom too. So I totally agree with you. I don't think, just like the Delta guy is talking about, I wonder if there's probably in this Corona season for the church, there's probably 20, 30, maybe 40% of some of the things we used to do that might have been unnecessary and just built up, calcified over time. But the reality is the gathering is here to stay, if I believe my Bible, like the Revelation 7 picture. Like it might just take different shape and different scale. But we do need to fight and figure out those ways to kind of get back together. Well, so what do you say, Rich? Just in kind of coming to a close, and man, I could talk to you all day. I know got things going on and people to see and lawns to mow and all that stuff. So
exactly.
But what would you say? So I got my people from church that pay attention to this, but the odd church leader, especially in Atlantic Canada, might be hearing this. What would you say, if you're looking at the next 10 years and you kind of want to be in that next Netflix position of, we saw the future, how would you encourage that church that maybe they're, asking the same questions we all are about, what do we do and how do we approach this next sort of season to come out for the better and not go down with it?
Well, I really do. Like I said, I'm a 3/4 full cup kind of guy. I really do think that the best is yet to come. But this could be the encouragement I would give to leaders that are listening in. And it ties into what we were just talking about there. This season has accelerated the value of innovation. And we need leaders who are willing to say, I've got this crazy idea. Let's try it. And I can say one of the early on, I know multisite today feels like it's just like standard church. It's like the normal thing to do. But I can tell you, I was there when I only knew 12 other churches in North America, and I couldn't believe there were 12 that were doing it. And it was a crazy idea, right? Mm-hmm. It was we're going to put teaching on video in public auditoriums and get people to come and see it. That was like a wildly crazy idea. We need that kind of innovation in this season, right? We need leaders. So if you're listening in and you're thinking like, I wonder if our church could try this, or to that exact other question, there's some stuff. It might be yourself saying, I've been leading this part of our ministry. I just want to raise a hand and say, I think we should get rid of it. I think if we drop this thing, it would have zero impact. That would be a gutsy move, and you would be celebrated. I know Brent; he would celebrate that. But I would encourage you to lean in and say, "Hey, what is that little thing that might be floating around in your brain that you could say, maybe this is the season for us to try that?" Because I do think we're in a rare season to be able to do that, and to try something new, and we're going to see that because I would agree with you. I'm like we are going to, get back to in-person services. That's going to be a piece of the puzzle. That is, I'm not I don't think we can get rid of all our buildings. But I do think it's going to look different. It's going to have a different flavor to it. And just because there's a person that was in leadership, 6 months ago, doesn't mean that they have the right ideas. Actually, I've got a blog post that's coming out in a couple weeks called COVID-19 Killed Church Consulting, Long Live Strategic Outsiders. And one of the things I realized as a person who does that, who is like a church coach, is there was a part of what I used to sell before March 15th that was like, hey, let me tell you about what we did 10 years ago, where that's completely irrelevant now. Like that doesn't mean anything anymore. No. It's only about encouraging innovation and doing this kind of thing, networking leaders together and being a wise voice to say like, hey, well, let's ask these 4 other questions. That's where the real value is. And so in some ways, it's like a great opportunity for leaders to step up and say, hey, I'd love to lead in this season and help push us forward.
Yeah, well, I can't recommend you as a strategic outsider more, my friend. So I appreciate your voice and your insight. And man, thanks a ton for taking the time today and being on my pod. And if you haven't checked out Rich's stuff, go check him out. Unseminary.com, correct?
Yep, that's right. That's the place to send them. Thank you so much. It's been so great being here, Brent.
I found you before I knew that you were connected with Carrie at all. Yeah, I've been on the seminary bandwagon for a long time, man. You're helping a lot of people, so appreciate it, man. Thank you. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rich Birch. If you haven't already, why don't you take a minute and go and check him out at unseminary.com. Check out his podcast. Make sure you subscribe. It's a great, great podcast. I listen to it every single week. And if you haven't already, why don't you subscribe to mine while you're at it? Go to the Speaking Of podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe, rate it, share it. Let as many people know about us as possible. Thanks again.